Julian Marchand had watched 11 men beg on the same stretch of concrete floor, right where it sloped toward the drain in Warehouse 9. Every one of them believed the right words could buy back what they owed. Not one of them had ever been right. Tonight made 12, a stevedore who'd sold pier schedules to Mateo Reyes for grocery money, and Julian didn't so much as blink before he nodded Theo toward the door. Then the service hatch at the back of the warehouse buckled open, and a woman stumbled through it with blood at her lip and rain in her hair, flanked by 2 of his men who clearly hadn't expected to find her hiding behind the crates. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She looked straight across the floor at Julian Marchand and said 2 words so quietly that only he heard them. "Save me." Nobody said that to Julian and meant it as anything but a joke. He would spend the rest of that week trying to answer 2 questions. What she'd been doing inside a Reyes ambush on his own pier, and why, for the first time in 10 years, he actually wanted to. Warehouse 9 sat at the dead end of the industrial canal, its loading doors still painted with the faded logo of a produce company that hadn't shipped a crate of anything in 6 years. To the Harbor Commission, it was overflow storage for Marchand Maritime and Provisions, 3 generations deep in dock contracts, and the kind of paperwork nobody ever double-checked. To everyone else on the river, it was where Julian settled things that couldn't be settled anywhere with witnesses. He had never lost his temper in this room. He had never needed to. Her name was Sasha Doran, 27, dispatcher for Bayou Pilot and Tow, the outfit that decided which licensed pilot boarded which ship coming up the Mississippi and which tug walked it home afterward. She had no business anywhere near Warehouse 9, and the 2 men still gripping her arms wanted Julian to know it. "Found her behind the pallets," one of them said. "She's been in here since before the Reyes boys showed." "I'm not with them." Sasha found her voice again now that the gun that had been pressed to her spine 10 minutes earlier was gone. "My sister's missing, Callie. She works the floor at your club and she stopped answering 2 nights ago. Someone at Le Corbeau told me she came down here Tuesday for a delivery, so I came down here too." One of Theo's men laughed under his breath, the kind of laugh that assumed the story ended with a body in the canal. Sasha didn't flinch. She'd spent 6 years untangling other people's mistakes out of shipping logs. She recognized a room that had already decided who she was before she'd said a word, and she'd learned a long time ago that flinching only sped that decision along. Julian studied her the way he studied a manifest that didn't add up. For the seam, the place where a story didn't quite meet itself. "And the Reyes crew just happened to be waiting in my warehouse when you walked in." "They weren't waiting for me." Her chin lifted, though her laced hands were shaking badly enough to give her away. "They were already here, setting something up behind the container stacks. I heard them say your name. I heard them say Thursday. The night the Bayou transfer moved $50 million in reserve gold off the freighter Almeria and into the vault beneath his club, an operation 11 people alive were cleared to know about. Something shifted under Julian's ribs that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with the sudden, cold certainty that his own docks had a hole in them. He didn't kill her, and he didn't let his men walk her out back either, which surprised Theo more than it surprised Julian himself. Theo caught his eye across the room, a silent, "You're really doing this," and Julian answered it by turning away from 12 years of habit and walking toward the woman instead of away from her. He had her sat down in the warehouse office, still dripping, and crouched until they were eye level. "You want your sister back. I want to know how Reyes put a crew on my pier without one of my men clocking it. We help each other, or neither of us gets anything." He held out a hand, not to shake, to pull her up. "Thursday morning. Find me the leak before that ship comes up the channel, and I'll find your sister." "And if I can't? Then we're both about to lose something we can't get back." He said it flatly, the way he said everything. And Sasha understood that flatness was the most honest thing about him. For the next day she sat in a back office above Le Corbeau Noir, with dispatch logs pulled from her own company's servers, and peer assignment sheets Theo handed over an hour at a time, watching her like she might set something on fire. The office smelled like every back room she'd ever worked in. Burnt coffee, marine diesel, the mildew of a building that flooded twice a decade and never quite dried out. And for an hour she almost forgot whose building it was. She was better at this than Julian expected. 6 years of matching tide charts to pilot licenses had taught her to see the shape of a lie inside a schedule the way other people saw shapes in clouds. She cross-referenced tide tables against license renewals against overtime sheets until the numbers stopped looking like numbers and started looking like a shape moving underneath the surface of the water. Patient and deliberate. By midnight she'd found it. 4 nights in the last 2 months, a licensed pilot named Delgado had been swapped at the last minute for an unlicensed second. A swap that only worked because someone with dispatch clearance had approved it after hours. Someone who could get inside Bayou Pilot's system without tripping an alarm. She stared at the login timestamp until her eyes burned, already knowing, in the sick way you know before you check, exactly whose password had opened that door. Her own. She hadn't worked any of those 4 nights. She'd been home each time, asleep, while somebody sitting at her own kitchen table used her laptop and her badge number to walk Reyes's men straight onto the water. There was only one person who had the keys to her apartment, her accounts, her life. Callie. Sasha's hands went cold around the edge of the desk. Callie wasn't just missing. Callie had been the door Reyes walked through, and whatever happened to her Tuesday night hadn't been an abduction. It had been a job that went wrong, or a job that was finally finished. Sasha thought of every unreturned text, every excuse about needing cash, and understood, with the particular nausea of loving someone you don't fully know, that she might have spent months protecting a stranger wearing her sister's face. She should have told Julian immediately. She didn't. Not because she planned to lie, because for 11 minutes, alone in that office with her sister's name glowing on the screen, she needed to be only a sister, and not yet the woman who'd have to decide what happened to one. Those 11 minutes were the mistake that told Julian everything. He came up the back stairs at midnight with 2 cups of chicory coffee and found her staring at a blank monitor, the real one minimized under a spreadsheet she'd hoped looked convincing. He set the cups down without a word, reached past her and clicked the taskbar. The login trail filled the screen. He read it once, then read the personnel file beside it. Sasha Doran, 22, hired 8 months ago to work the hostess stand at his own club, and something in his face went very still, which Sasha had learned by now was far more dangerous than shouting. "You found your leak 6 hours ago," he said quietly, "and you sat on it. She's my sister. She's the reason Reyes knows my schedule better than my own harbor master." He straightened, and for the first time since the warehouse, Sasha saw the version of him that had let 12 men kneel on that concrete floor. "Give me a reason not to treat this exactly like every other leak I've ever plugged." For a moment, she said nothing, because the honest answer was that she didn't have one, not one that would hold up against a man who'd built an empire on never once letting a good excuse change his mind. Sasha stood so fast the chair scraped the floor. "Because I can use it. Whoever's running Callie doesn't know I've found the login. If I keep feeding real assignments through my system and drop one fake one, anyone who moves on it is either Reyes's man or my sister, and either way, you'll know exactly who's coming and when. You want the leak. I just handed you the trap. The only thing I'm asking is that when we pull her out of it, she walks away breathing." Julian looked at her a long moment, weighing a promise he'd never once made to anyone. "If she's only a victim in this, I'll consider it. If she pulled the trigger on her own, that promise is between you and her, not me." It wasn't a yes. It was the closest thing to one she was going to get, and she took it. On Wednesday night, Sasha fed a false assignment into her own dispatch system, an unscheduled tug pulling a decoy barge past Pier 6, a full day ahead of the real transfer, then sat in the cab of a company truck 200 yards off with Julian beside her, and Theo's men spread through the container yard like they'd grown out of the concrete. Sasha had spent 6 years reading water and weather for a living, and had never once felt time move the way it moved in that cab, thick and reluctant, every minute daring her to believe nothing was coming. For 2 hours, nothing happened. Rain needled the windshield. Julian didn't fidget, didn't check his watch, didn't do any of the small human things people did when they were afraid. And Sasha found herself watching him instead of the pier, until the radio in her lap crackled with the call sign of a boat that didn't exist in her system. "They took the bait." She was out of the truck and down the access ramp before Julian could stop her, because the shape coming off the tug in the rain was small and quick and moved exactly the way her sister moved. "Callie!" The name tore out of her before she could stop it, and that single mistake was enough. Two men she hadn't seen came off the shadow of the crane. The smaller shape bolted the other direction, and then there was a gun in someone's hand that wasn't Julian's, and the world became noise. Sasha felt herself grabbed, felt the wet concrete rush up, felt a fist close around the back of her jacket right as the pier's edge went from a rumor to a very real drop into black water. It wasn't the shove that saved her. It was Julian, half a second ahead of the men closing in, hauling her backward with enough force to put her on the ground behind him, while he emptied 2 rounds into the dark, until whoever had grabbed her let go of the idea entirely. When it was over, one Reyes runner lay face down near the crane. Theo had a second zip-tied against a container, and the small shape that had bolted was gone, swallowed by the yard and the rain and every choice she'd already made. Sasha's ears were still ringing. Somewhere under the ringing was her sister's name, and she hated, more than she'd hated anything in years, that some small, stupid part of her was already looking for a way to forgive whatever came next. Julian hauled Sasha up by the arm, checking her for blood that wasn't there with a roughness that had nothing to do with anger. "You don't run at a gun," he said, low and furious, his hand still fisted in her jacket like he hadn't decided to let go yet. "That's my sister out there. That's a woman who left you standing on the edge of a pier." His grip gentled even as his voice didn't. "Whatever she used to be to you, she isn't running from Reyes tonight. She's running from you finding out what she already knows." He took her to the apartment above Le Corbeau Noir instead of back to Warehouse 9, a narrow set of rooms above the kitchen that smelled of proofing bread and good bourbon, the only place in the city, she'd learn later, that Julian actually slept. She sat on the edge of a leather sofa with a towel around her shoulders and shook for a long time after the adrenaline finally let go of her, and Julian, who hadn't comforted anyone in a decade for the very good reason that he'd never wanted to, poured 2 glasses of something dark and sat close enough that his shoulder was a warm line against hers. "She used to steal my hairbrush and swear she didn't," Sasha said finally, staring at the glass instead of drinking it. "I raised her half the time our mother couldn't. I don't know how to be the person standing on a pier deciding what happens to her." Julian turned the glass in his hand once, twice, watching the bourbon catch the light instead of her face, because some things were easier to say to a glass than to a person who might believe them. "I had a brother once who made choices I couldn't forgive either," he said finally. "I didn't get the version of tonight where I found out in time to choose differently. You don't have to decide it tonight." His voice had lost its edge, gone rough instead, private in a way she suspected very few people ever heard. "Tonight you only have to decide if you still want the truth, even if it's worse than the leak." "I do." She looked up at him, closer than she'd meant to be, close enough to see the exhaustion under the ice. "What do you have to decide?" "Whether I still believe you didn't know." His hand came up, thumb brushing rain cold along her jaw, and something in his face, controlled for a decade, deliberate for longer, cracked just enough to let her see the man underneath the reputation. "I do believe it. That's the problem. Nobody's argued their way past me in 10 years, and you didn't even try." The Reyes runner Theo had zip-tied talked by morning, the way men always eventually did in a room with Theo in it. And what he gave up was worse than a robbery. Reyes didn't want the gold sitting in Julian's vault. He wanted it sitting on the bottom of the river with Julian's name attached to the manifest, because a federal boat with cameras already running would be waiting downriver Thursday night, tipped off by an anonymous call about undeclared bullion moving off the Almeria. Reyes didn't need to win a war with Julian. He only needed the Coast Guard to finish it for him while he filed the paperwork to absorb every dock contract Julian left behind. And the pilot assignment meant to guide the Almeria's cargo up the false channel Reyes had rigged, straight into those waiting cameras, had already gone in, not through Sasha's decoy system, through the real one, approved 4 hours earlier under Sasha's login, from an IP address inside her own apartment. It meant Callie was still in that apartment, or had been recently enough to matter. It meant every hour Sasha had spent hating her sister for running was an hour Callie had spent finishing the job anyway, alone, with nobody left to explain herself to. "She's not hiding from us," Sasha said, reading the timestamp twice to be sure her legs would hold. "She's finishing the job. It's not the day after tomorrow anymore. It's happening tonight, on the real transfer, because she still has my password." Julian was already reaching for his phone. "Then we move the transfer up." "You can't. The tide's wrong for the Almeria before 11. And if you rush the pilot swap yourself, you're the one who looks like he's hiding something from federal cameras." She was already pulling her jacket back on, running channel charts through her mind that she'd memorized years before she ever cared who owned the docks. "But I dispatch this company. I can walk onto that ship as the pilot's second and nobody blinks because that's my job. Let me on that water, Julian. I'm the only one who can put her back on the right channel without anyone downriver ever knowing she left it." By 10 that night, Sasha stood on the Almeria's bridge in a pilot's vest 2 sizes too big, watching the lights of a false channel marker blink green half a mile off the bow, exactly where someone had rigged it to. The real buoy sat dark 50 yards to its left, cut off from the shore relay by a hand that knew precisely which wire to pull, because that hand had grown up in the same house Sasha had. For nearly a full minute, her hand hovered over the console without moving, caught between the sister she'd raised and a ship full of men who had no idea how close they were sailing to a headline. She waited until the licensed pilot beside her was deep in the handoff checklist, then quietly walked the heading 4 degrees back onto the true channel, careful not to trip an alarm that would bring Reyes's federal tip in early. It should have been enough. It would have been enough, except the radio crackled with Callie's voice, low and frantic, patched through a frequency only harbor crew used. "Sash, don't. Please don't do this. If that ship doesn't hit the flagged channel, Reyes doesn't get paid. And if he doesn't get paid, I'm the only name left on his ledger. You fix this channel, you're not saving Julian. You're killing me." Sasha's hand froze over the console. Every year of loving her sister rose up against every hour of the last 2 days. And for one full breath, she understood exactly why a person might fold first and ask questions after. Then she thought about a camera crew waiting downriver for a ship that was never meant to make it home, and about a man on the shore who'd broken 10 years of silence over a woman he'd known 4 days. And she keyed the radio instead of the wheel. "Then come get on this ship and tell them yourself, Callie. I'm not drowning 50 million in gold and 100 men's jobs to keep you out of a courtroom. I love you. I'm not doing that." The private channel went silent. Then, over the ship's own deck radio, not Callie's frequency, Julian's voice cut in, low and absolutely certain. "Sasha, hold your heading. I'm coming to you." He came by launch, cutting across the freighter's wake in the dark with Theo at the wheel, boarding the Almeria off a rope ladder before the licensed pilot had even registered a second party on his bridge. What followed on the open deck wasn't clean. 2 of Reyes's men, hidden in a container stacked for exactly this contingency, came up shooting the moment they understood the false channel wasn't going to save them. Somewhere below decks, an alarm nobody had scheduled began to whine, and Sasha spent the worst 90 seconds of her life flat against a bulkhead, while Julian and Theo answered them round for round in the freezing dark. When it stopped, one shooter was down, and the other was face first on the deck plating with Theo's knee between his shoulders, and Callie, who had come aboard the launch after all, soaked and shaking and armed with nothing but a burner phone and a debt she couldn't outrun, stood frozen at the rail with her hands already lifting before anyone told her to raise them. Sasha reached her sister before Julian did. She didn't hug her. She took the phone out of Callie's hand, gently, the way you'd take something sharp from a child, and said the only thing she had left. "It's over, Cal. Whatever happens next, it's finally over." Dawn came up gray and ordinary over the river, as if the night hadn't tried to end 3 lives on it. Reyes's operation folded within the week, once the anonymous federal tip turned into a case against the men who'd actually rigged the false buoy signal. Men Julian handed over personally, along with a data trail Sasha had built clean enough to survive a courtroom. Because for once, the story he could tell the authorities happened to be entirely true. Mateo Reyes lost the docks he'd spent 2 years trying to steal, and gained a legal problem large enough to keep him out of New Orleans for a long time. Theo took over the day-to-day running of the pier within a month, and if he ever resented the woman who'd first walked in soaked and accused of being a spy, He never once said so within Julian's hearing. Callie's problem was smaller and somehow harder. She'd broken federal law for a debt that was never fully hers, cornered by threats against a mother Sasha hadn't even known Reyes had found, and a prosecutor with no particular love for the Marchand name was prepared to make an example of her anyway. Sasha asked Julian for exactly one thing that week, standing in his office at Le Corbeau Noir, quietly, using the same 2 words she'd said to him on the floor of Warehouse 9. Except this time, they weren't for herself. Save her. Julian Marchand, who had let 11 men beg on that warehouse floor and felt nothing, who had built a decade of quiet on the simple fact that pleading never worked on him, looked at the woman standing in his office and made a call to a lawyer he'd used exactly twice in 15 years. Callie Doran walked out of a federal building 2 months later with probation, a cooperation agreement, and her sister waiting at the curb instead of a cell number and a visitation schedule. Julian never told Sasha exactly what that phone call cost him, in favors owed or reputation spent, and she never asked, because she understood by then that a man who'd ignored every plea in the city for a decade didn't grant one because it was easy. He granted it because of who was asking. She found him on the balcony above the club that night, the quarter loud and gold beneath them, and pressed her forehead briefly against his shoulder before she said anything at all. "You could have said no." "I could have." He turned, tipping her chin up with 2 fingers, the same rough gentleness he'd used the night he pulled her back from the edge of a pier. "I've said no to better arguments than yours for 10 years. I stopped being able to say no to you somewhere around a warehouse floor, and 2 words I still don't fully understand." "Which 2 words?" "Save me." He said it like he was testing whether it still had power over him, and found, when he looked at her, that it did. He kissed her there on the balcony, unhurried, like a decision he'd already made and simply hadn't announced yet. And Sasha understood that whatever came next, the docks, the danger, a family that would never fully welcome an outsider, she wasn't asking to be saved anymore. She'd already done the saving. Now she was simply staying. Did Julian and Sasha's fight for the docks keep you holding your breath until the very last page? The river keeps its secrets, and so does the Marchand family. If this story of loyalty, betrayal, and a love that refused to stay cold pulled you in, hit that like button, share it with someone who loves a slow-burn mafia romance, and subscribe for more forbidden love stories from the underworld. Tell us in the comments, would you have risked everything for a sister who'd already chosen someone else? Would you have whispered those same 2 words?